Hi everyone, my name is Gia Graham and I'm a designer, illustrator, and hand lettering artist. I love working with color, particularly with limited color palettes. Every month I create a new color palette to work with for the entire month. Now my newsletter subscribers are usually the ones to get the first peek at the palette each month, but I'm going to break the rules and give the Design Cuts community a first look at the September colors and artwork, as well as share my process for working with a limited palette. So let's get started. So here's my palette, which has 5 main colors and 3 bonus colors. You'll notice that my bonus colors are just slight variations of the 3 main colors, so they won't shift the overall mood of the palette. They will just allow me to bring a little more depth into the illustration. I've already added the colors to my palette window here, and this is the piece I'll be working on. And to save time, I've already inked the sketch. I like to ink everything in black first and then think about the color afterwards. As you can see, I've inked several of the elements on different layers, which makes it easier for me to make color changes. So I have the lettering on one layer, the main leaves and stems are inked all together on another layer, slightly smaller leaves, these little stems and details. And for the flowers, I put the foreground petals on one layer and the background petals on a separate layer below. Now it takes a little time and thought up front to organize layers in this way, but it allows for more flexibility and for quick and easy changes when adding color and dimension. I actually share my step-by-step process for layer management in my Fun with Florals class on Skillshare, so feel free to take a look at that if you'd like more insight on that process. Now, I'm first going to choose a background color. So I'll tap on the background color layer and the palette window will pop up, and I'm going to tap on this dark blue and it automatically fills the background. Now I'm just going to go ahead and place the rest of my colors. I've selected the darker of the 2 greens, and here on my main leaves and stems layer, I'm going to turn on Alpha Lock, then tap Fill Layer. As you can see, with Alpha Lock on, only the inked areas will be filled. For the second leaf layer, I'm going to use the lighter version of that color. Now, even that slight difference in shade between the leaves will help the illustration look a little less flat. Now for this layer, I'm going to try the dark lavender and the bright lavender here on this layer. Now for the flowers. I'm going to choose the lighter coral color so that I can use the darker version for shading and to add dimension. So I'm going to go ahead and fill both petal layers with this light coral. And lastly, I'm going to try white for the lettering. Let's see how that goes. By the way, when working with a limited palette, you can always use white as a bonus color because it doesn't really change the mood of the overall palette. On the other hand, I always advise against throwing black into the mix because it makes a big difference in the way the palette looks. Now I've got colors placed for all the elements, and these might change as I go along depending on how everything is coming together, but at least I've got a solid starting point. Now it's time to add some detail and dimension. So let's start with the flowers. Remember, I have a foreground layer and a background layer. So I'm going to tap on the background layer and add a new layer above it and make that new layer a clipping mask. Now I'll choose the darker coral, and I want some texture here. So I'm going to use the Smudge Dot Sprayer from the Dirty Halftones brush set. And I'll just add that darker color into the areas between the petals to give the flowers some dimension. And you don't have to be too heavy-handed here. Just a little color and texture between these petal layers will have a lot of impact. See what a difference that already makes? Even though they're mostly the same color, just having that darker shade in the right areas is already adding a lot more life to the flowers. And I want to add some line details too. So I'm going to add a new layer above the petals, but I'm going to make sure it's below the leaves and stems layer. Then I'll switch to the old inker brush. That's also in the Dirty Halftones brush set. And I'm going to choose white, and then just add a few lines at the base of the flowers. Now I want to add lines to these leaves as well, so I'm going to make a new layer above all of the leaf layers. And I want the lines to contrast a little with this bluish green color, so I'm going to use the darkest color, which is the same blue as the background. The leaves still feel a little flat, so I'm going to add some subtle texture here. Even though I don't have a lot of different colors to choose from, I can still make subtle but effective impact with the two greens that I do have. So I'm going to add a clipping mask above the leaves and stems layer, which is in the darker green. And actually, let me hide the second leaf layer so it doesn't get confusing. Now, since these leaves are in the darker green, I'm going to choose the lighter shade. And I'm going to go back to the Smudge Dot sprayer brush. And add the subtle texture to the tips of the leaves. Now I'll turn back on the other leaf layer, add a clipping mask above that, and I'm going to switch back to the lighter green and do the same on the tips of these leaves as well. Okay, I'm just gonna pull back and have a look. Let's see, looking at these bits, I actually think I want them in green as well, so that the bright lavender little specks will stand out more. And I think I can do something more interesting with the lettering as well, because that feels a little flat. So what I'm going to do is first change the color of the lettering to the same blue as the background, so it's basically just going to disappear. And I'm going to try something fun with Abby Uproot's Everything Watercolor brush set. I'm going to add a clipping mask above and choose the AN Stain Smudger brush. Rather than a stark white, I'm going to use the lightest color in the palette, which is this light pink. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill the letters with some fun watercolor texture. And because I made the letters blue first, you can see that if I just lightly add the watercolor texture, it will look more translucent almost. And where I add more color, it will look a little more opaque. So I'm just going to keep slowly working on this, building up more of these painterly layers until it's looking the way I want it to. And keeping in mind that the point of this is to add some interest and some texture, so I'm going to make sure that some areas are a little bit more opaque than others, just to give me some variation. And I actually want to try mixing a second color here, so I'm going to add yet another clipping mask and choose the bright lavender color. And this time I'm going to try the AN Dark Edge Bleeder for this one. So I'm just going to go in and add that little pop of color just towards the bottom of each of these letters. So it's not quite creating a gradient, but it's just adding a little more interest. There, I think just having that little extra color in there kind of helps bring some life to it. I feel like I can take this a step further by adding some subtle texture to the background. So first let me add a new layer just above the background layer. So I'm going to go back to the Dirty Halftone brush set, and I really like this Diagonal Lines texturizer, so I'm going to try using that. Now I've already used every color in the palette, so this is where I can get a little creative. What I'm going to do is choose white, and I'll add the texture on that new layer I just created. Then I'm going to reduce the opacity on the texture layer so it's much more subtle, but it still creates some interest. So you can see I've created a tone-on-tone look without having to add another color to my palette. Now for the final touch, I'm just going to add a few random dots and specks around the flowers. So I'll create a new layer at the very top. And I'm going to switch to the Extra Freckles brush. That's also in the Dirty Halftones brush set. I'm just going to add a few little specks here and there. Kind of makes it look like little tufts of baby's breath flowers. And I'm not going to be too intentional about placement. I'm just going to randomly place them around each flower. And there's the result. I managed to add texture and depth to the artwork while just using 5 main colors. I hope it was helpful to see a few of the different ways you can make limited colors work for you. Be sure to scroll below to get the brushes used in this session, and thanks so much for joining me.